Good evening. And I'm Merle Woberding. I'm one of the trustees of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to welcome all of you to Dayton. This is a wonderful event, a wonderful evening, and as you all know, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize arose on and was inspired by the 1995 Dayton Peace Accords, and we're in our 8th or 9th year now, and we've just had wonderful success, and it's just a great wonder to have everyone here and enjoy the evening. So we hope you enjoy it. But more than anything else, I want to thank, and the reason it's successful is because of you. It's the patrons and those who contribute their services, their money. We're a nonprofit organization. We're totally volunteers. There's not a paid person in the organization, and we really appreciate what you do for the organization, and that's why we're here tonight, because of all of you. So I want to thank you all for it. And this year, and Sharon will be up here in a minute, but this year we sold out before the official invitations went out. So this was just a wonderful, wonderful event. We want to thank the people that let us use this place, the University of Dayton, Father Dan Curran, Paul Benson. I know Paul's here. I saw him. Paul, thank you very much. It's a wonderful facility and a great pleasure to be able to use it. I want to introduce quickly the fellow trustees on the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, co-chair Sharon Rabb, Mark Meister, Tom Lasley, and me. And now Doris Ponitz is the fifth, and she's not able to be here this evening, and we wish her well. Also want to thank Ellen Belcher and Tom Lasley for all their work in making tonight possible. It's a beautiful evening, and we're really excited about it. And with that, before I go further, I'll ask Sharon to come up here. She'd like to say a couple of words. Sharon Rabb, the chair of the Peace Prize.
Thank you, Merle, and thank you, everyone. And as he said, we were sold out before the invitations. So when you get that little white letter next year, my advice would be get that in as soon as you possibly can, because we were just I don't want to say overwhelmed, but we were so happy that so many people would like to come. And I have to say, having had many conversations with these wonderful authors, and here's Andrew Solomon, straight from New York. Straight from New York via Atlanta and Cincinnati. Anyway, what I would like to request that you have those questions ready, because the thing that makes this a special evening is when you begin to engage with the authors. So start thinking of those questions that it's the teacher, sorry, but start thinking of those questions that you would like to ask these wonderful people, because what a rich legacy we have here of these authors. So thank you for coming. We'll see you tomorrow night. By the way, Doris is coming tomorrow night, so get to say hi to her. Okay, thank you.
Okay, a couple of special guests. One of the judges this year is Christopher Surf. Thank you again, Stan. Appreciate it. Chris is not only the judge this year, but he's a poet, a writer, an author, a producer, a lyricist, a composer. He's got it all, so we really enjoy your coming here, Chris. And also like for Catherine Vaz to come. Catherine teaches creative writing at Harvard, but I've said it before, so you'll probably get tired, but I love her work. The book that I love so much, I gotta look. And I remember it because I used to, when I was in college, I used to talk about going to Our Lady of the Mattress. So when I go to church, I think of Our Lady of the Artichokes, which is the name of her book, and it always brings back fresh memories for me. Okay, we have a super great panel tonight. And we have some people who've joined us from prior years and the winners from this year, so this will be a wonderful panel. But to introduce them quick, it's the 2011 runner-up in fiction, and I ran into her earlier, and I've been practicing for 2 years, Maaza Mengiste. And then last year's winner in fiction for the Sojourn, Andrew Krivak. Andrew. And everyone will remember last year's speech for the Richard Holbrooke Award by Tim O'Brien. Tim, thank you for coming back. Now this year we have Gilbert King. Where is Gilbert? Yeah, stand up. The nonfiction runner-up, Devil in the Grove. Andrew Solomon, who just came from a great travel day. Thank you. And Adam Johnson. Yeah. And this year's Richard Holbrooke winner, Wendell Berry. I had a chance to swap some farm stories with Wendell beforehand, so I learned a little bit more than the farm than I remembered. But the panel's going to be moderated by our own Bob Fogarty, president or professor emeritus at Antioch and editor of the Antioch Review. Bob, thank you.
I guess everybody knew that peace was difficult to attain, and it took some struggle. I don't know how it compares, however, with traveling. It probably is second best, actually, when compared to traveling in America in particular. We're going to reverse the procedure slightly. I'm going to ask Wendell a question. And then I'll ask the individuals who are winning the awards this year, and then we'll come to those who've already won awards, so if that's okay with everybody. I have two questions, actually, for Wendell and for others also. It's always curious when you publish a book, and in Wendell's case, many books, because you never know what kind of a reaction you're going to get from critics and by readers. And sometimes it's very unpredictable. I published a book some years ago, and it was reviewed in the New York Times. And the first phone call came from a slightly addled former classmate of mine who said that he had recommended the book to Mrs. Carter. And that he had written to the White House about it and that she should read it. It was a fairly scholarly book, and I don't think the kind of reading that Mrs. Carter engaged in, and I thought, well, I'm going to finally make it onto the FBI list. I always falsely thought I was there before, but that's another matter. I guess the first question I have is, for Wendell, what surprising reactions, if any, have you had to the publications of your books? Have you had any reactions that seem to you odd or peculiar or... Go ahead. Yes.
When I was young and ignorant, the most surprised I was that there was no reaction at all.
Yes.
Occasionally, I've done something that brought forth an adverse reaction. I came out, I guess you would say, in public as as a person who was not going to buy a computer, and that caused me a great deal of grief and caused my wife grief. But and then I wrote a piece supporting gay marriage, and that caused me some trouble. Actually, I was ready for that, and I'd had that earlier experience, so that didn't trouble me very much. I just had a pretty interesting time answering my mail for a while. There's some things to say back to the people who are against gay marriage, and I said them. I didn't advocate that everybody ought to become homosexual. All I said was that it's wrong to make a right for the sole reason of refusing to give it to some people. And I said further that you can't copyright the marriage vows, and anybody who wants to get married can get married anytime they want to. That's my entire argument.
I have a second question, and it's what sometimes is called a hobby hints question. Namely, when you read literary magazines, there are always sort of ways, how do you write a story and things like that. And they're hobby hints quite often. You've written both fiction and nonfiction. Do you think of those as totally different audiences, or are they one audience?
I have no idea. There are two different ways of writing, is all I can tell you. I look at this from pretty much the inside out, and I've usually written essays because I was agitated or worried or frightened, and I've written stories because I come from people who tell stories, and I like telling stories. I don't know about the audience much.
Well, we'll find out what the audience thinks later, and you may be surprised.
I may.
Yes. Could I ask the individuals who've won awards this year have a similar question? Namely, have you had surprising reactions to your books?
Is that me? Well, I wrote a book about North Korea. It's a novel, and it's an imagined work. Maybe there'll be a Q&A tomorrow, and we can talk about, more in depth. I think a lot of Americans respond to the book by saying, how imaginative, that you dreamed up this totalitarian state. I was surprised to hear from a lot of people for whom totalitarianism is a memory of their lifetime and something they experienced. And a lot of Americans are amongst us who were raised in that paradigm. Vietnamese Americans, the partition of their country has many similarities to North Korea. Germany, I just did a tour in Germany, and it was striking how palpable the partition of that country is, and the legacy of the Stasi. But people from Poland, from Hungary, from the Middle East, from countries where people don't have the freedom to assemble and speak the way we are tonight. And I guess I was surprised that those folks were walking amongst me and were not identifying themselves, that they had been through such difficult times.
Mm-hmm. Andrew?
And my book is roughly about how families deal with children who are different from them in various ways. Families of deaf people, of autistic people, comes out of my experience as the gay child of straight parents, looking at issues of identity. Families of people with schizophrenia, families of people who commit crimes, families bringing up children conceived in rape, et cetera, et cetera. And my favorite bit of correspondence actually came from someone who wrote to me and said, very much in earnest, he said, "You've examined so many kinds of problematic difference within families, but you didn't write anything about my situation, and I hope you will understand how traumatic it can be if you are a dog person and your son is not a dog person." So I thought that was a good window into public consciousness. But having said that, and without meaning to sound too much like an echoing my co-panelist, the issue, because I write in the book a little bit about my experience as a gay person who is married and has children, I've had both responses of great, enormous, this is the most wonderful thing that I've ever heard, and I've had a certain amount of, you represent the end of civilization. And it's always difficult for me to wrap my mind around the idea that the descriptions in my book of love could seem to anyone to be the end of civilization rather than an extension of it. That there are people who seem to think that the existence of the relationships that I've described in the book somehow undermines the integrity of other relationships, when I think, in fact, that the diversity of kinds of love is actually what strengthens the world and makes it a place I want to be living in. So that's been the sort of shocker.
I wrote a book about Thurgood Marshall in this To Kill a Mockingbird type case that took place in 1949 in the South, in Florida. And I think probably the most important or the most surprising thing that I get a lot are the letters from people in this town who are literally in their 70s and 80s who had no idea that this case was happening. This case, in their lifetimes, was on the front page of the New York Times. Thurgood Marshall had come down to argue it. There was violence all over the place, and yet they were surprised that this happened because their parents had shielded them from this. And the most surprising are the letters I get from the family of the Groveland boys who said, basically they say, thank you, we never knew anything about our family, because it was such a matter of grief and sorrow and shame that we were never told of any of this. And it was a way the parents had of protecting these children from this violent racism that was happening and affecting their own family members, and they didn't want their children to be exposed to it. So they knew nothing about their grandparents, they knew nothing about their uncle, they only know that he died tragically, but it was forbidden to be talking about. And so receiving those letters, and in fact, some people had never seen photographs of their own family members until they looked at the book. So I always thought that was the most surprising thing, because I just couldn't imagine that being possible.
I have one question for all of the individuals who've already won awards and are here this evening to sort of continue the tradition of people coming back who have won awards. It's a simple question. Since your award, what have you been doing? I have three options. Planning a new project, living extravagantly, or sitting on your laurels. Tim?
For many of you know that I have two little boys. They were here last year and dressed as penguins in their tuxedos. And I've been a dad since leaving here. I'm in the midst of a book. I'm probably halfway through or three-quarters of the way through, about being an older father. And it's so I'm working on my book and learning from my kids.
Can I add an option?
Sure, of course.
I paid my taxes.
We just want the truth.
I'm on the finishing end of my second book, so I've been working on that project, another war story. So get ready.
I'm doing the same thing Tim's doing. I'm working on my second novel, which I'm more than halfway through, and also living and struggling every day with my three children, 7, 5, and 3, so they're quite the handful.
Andrew, I'm halfway through your book and enthralled, and I'm wondering, how long did it take you to do the research and compile it?
It took me 11 years from the time I sold it to the time that it was sent off to be typeset. So it was a long and laborious process, resulting in a long book. But it was partly a matter of working through what the concept really was, because it changed a lot as I was working on it, and it was partly a matter of interviewing. I interviewed about 300 families in the course of doing the book, and those interviews, finding the families, getting them to agree to talk to me, talking to them, dealing with the transcripts and so on, it was a long haul. Yeah.
Drew, how did the book change you and the people around you as a result?
The work on the book was enormous, was really transformative. I had written 20 years ago an article about the deaf and about the idea of deaf culture and about the ways in which I thought the deaf experience, that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, that those parents often try to get them to conform to the standards of the hearing world, and that those deaf people discover great community when they reach adolescence or thereafter in the deaf world. That was something, and I saw great parallels between that experience and the gay experience, and then began to see these parallels with a variety of other experiences. But I think before I started the book that I was still uncomfortable in some ways with other people's difference, uncomfortable with differences that were unlike my own. There's a mother in the book who described being on an elevator at a hospital, and she was holding her daughter, who was a dwarf, and somebody got into the elevator who had a child with Down syndrome. She said, and I was standing on that elevator and looking at this woman and thinking, I can deal with mine, but I could never deal with yours. She said, and then I looked up at the woman's face and realized she was looking at me the exact same way. And I felt as though the discovery of the book was that the experience I had had as a gay person, which had seemed to me to be to give me something in common with other gay people, actually gave me something in common with the better part of humanity, because the negotiation of difference within families is such a universal. And I chose, while I was working on the book, to have children myself, and I think that choice was very much informed by the sense that there are so many different structures of family, there are so many different challenges that can arise, and there's the potential in all of those challenging circumstances for such great and profound love. And I think the book made me a nicer person, a more accepting person, a more generous person. I may still need to work on all of those things, but I'm farther along than I was before I started it.
Hi, this is for Mr. O'Brien. I, too, am an older parent, so I want to know if you have the same experiences, fears that I do. What is your greatest joy, and what is your greatest fear being an older parent?
As a novelist and a short story writer, I have trouble with abstraction. I can't come up with examples without doing a story. So I'll give you the joy part as a quick little anecdote. 6 months ago, my wife was driving my two kids home from school in Austin, Texas, where I live. And they were driving through a neighborhood that was bad. And they saw a man with his hat out crying on the streets of Austin. And my older son, who's now 10, said, Mommy, stop the car, stop the car. And my wife said, I can't. It's rush hour, and there's nowhere to stop it. There's cars everywhere. There's nowhere to stop. And the kid started crying, and he cried for 45 minutes as he came home to where we live outside Austin. I was sitting in my study writing, and the boy came in the door, and I knew instantly something bad had happened. His face was all red, and there were little tears. And I thought he'd, done something bad at school, and I was ready to, get on his case. And I said, what happened? And he said, I can't talk about it, and he walked away, and then the younger kid came in the door, and he was shaky. And then my wife came through, and I said, what happened? And she said, I don't want to talk about it. So I went into the kitchen, and where they'd all congregated, and the older boy who'd been doing all the crying was sitting up on the kitchen counter, and I went over to him, and I said, what happened? And he said, I'm not going to tell you. You have to talk to Mom. So I went to dinner. About 10 minutes later, I said, come on, somebody tell me what happened. And my wife, the kid, the older boy who had been crying, got off his chair and lay on the floor and started bawling. And my wife whispered to me essentially what had happened. They saw this homeless guy and had his hat out, and he was crying, and my wife couldn't stop to help him. The next morning, my kids have to get up early. We live a long way from school. At 5 in the morning, I went out, as I always do every morning, and the older boy was sitting on the kitchen counter again, writing a letter to this homeless guy. It said, "To my 15th Street friend, you don't deserve the life you have." This is a 10-year-old. He said, I want to try to do something to make you feel better. And he said in the letter, "I'm packing a bag for you." And beside Timmy was this is at 5 in the morning. He put a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, a yo-yo, a copy of one of my books. The most bizarre odds and ends in this little package. Well, joy, any parent in here knows the joy of, I mean, I give to the United Way, but I don't cry for the homeless. I mean, you know how adulthood inures you to this and hardens you to it? And the joy of seeing the humanity in this 10-year-old kid whom I'd thought previously cared about nothing but his computer, period. You know, Minecraft, and that's it. To have this coming out of this little boy actually crying and then spending his wake, you know, right out of bed, writing a letter to this boy, to this man. So that's just an anecdote. And I think that it's interesting it's not just the content of the anecdote, it's what story is as opposed to abstraction. Like the first question was hard to answer because it was abstract. It was hard to get my head around it. This one elicited a story.
My question is actually for Adam Johnson. In reading your book, like, you know, it just feels so real. And my question, you kind of sort of answered that somewhat, but how much of it is you really heard from someone from that region?
It's a work of fiction, but it's set in a very real place, in a place we're quite curious about. And there's an interweaving of research and the necessities of a narrative arc that has its own demands when you're trying to make a literary work that functions on multiple levels, that has a totality of effect, and all those novelistic things. I would say that almost every detail in the book was sourced from research. There's probably a few, and I could name them, that I made up and why I made them up. You know, loudspeakers, people having their tattoos cut off. I mean, I found examples of all of this behavior. It's probably very fictional that one person would see all of these things. And that was a big license I took in North Korea. You cannot really travel out of the zone where you're born. It's a very compartmentalized society, and I wanted to do a grand tour because I was fascinated with the place. That's quite fictional. And the big question is, though the surface I feel is fairly accurate, is what is the psychological portrait? You know, North Koreans can't tell their own stories. You know, they can't speak for themselves. And so while I can find out all these little tidbits I feel kind of confident about, I wasn't raised under totalitarianism. It's hard to like wonder if, wow, it may be factual. Is it psychologically true? That's the thing I don't know, and I can't find out. And it's very difficult because a lot of the people who make it out of North Korea are very damaged, and they need a lot of help telling their stories, honestly. They're traumatized, they have survivor's guilt, they've been trained not to speak their minds their entire lives, etc. So it's kind of a voice, it's one of the more voiceless places on earth, I think. So I don't know about that human dimension is the one I'm more curious about, rather than do they use fishing boats or how many people did they kidnap. The kidnaps were based on, you know, actual kidnappings pretty accurately. But the human dimension is what I was after, and in the end, that's the maybe the shakiest one.
Thank you.
I have both a short comment and a question. First, Merle referenced the fact that Adam gave a wonderful acceptance speech at last year's ceremony. And I would just like to let everyone know that on the Dayton Literary Peace Prize website, we have videos of all of the acceptance speeches for the last 3 or 4 years. And I was just watching Tim's and Andrew's just the other day, and it's really wonderful to see again. So if you go to DaytonLiteraryPeacePrize.org and go to the winners, you will be able to watch acceptance speeches. I have a question for Mr. Berry. I'm reading your wonderful essays in A Continuous Harmony. And in Discipline and Hope, you were talking about the Pentagon, but I think it applies to any large organization. And you said, the Pentagon is an institution, not a person. And unless constrained by the moral vision of persons within them, institutions move in the direction of power and self-preservation, not high principle. And that got me thinking about the Citizens United decision in the last couple of years from the Supreme Court and how these large institutions are being granted more personhood than before, and particularly profound influence on our electoral process. And I just wondered what your reflections, I believe your essay was written many years ago. I'm not quite sure when this collection was put together, but I was curious to know your reflections on the personhood of institutions today.
Well, it seems to me to be strange that we've become a country that could produce an argument against the obvious. A corporation is not a person, nor is any other institution. And universities are not persons. If you want a reaction from the heart, you've got to go to a person, a 10-year-old person. This is Tim's 10-year-old boy has got more heart than all the corporations in the country, and all the universities thrown in, and most of the governments beyond the fiscal courts and the small cities. So I think the concern was obvious then, and it's valid. It's more clear to me now than it was when I wrote that the business of an organization or an institution is to continue, not necessarily to do what it's supposed to do. And I think the universities are getting themselves in a terrible situation because that's mainly what they're concerned with, I think. The last thing they want is for somebody to have a new thought in one of them.
Please.
I have a question for all of the panelists or any of them that would care to answer it. I know that as a reader, it is inevitable that I will form some mental image and ideas about the nature and character and even personality and idiosyncrasies of the author of the book that I'm reading. I wonder what conclusions your readers have drawn about you and communicated to you that you found to be particularly erroneous.
I'll make a go at that one because I think I have a representative anecdote to tell, which is that I wrote a novel that came out in 1994, recently reissued, which was loosely based on the period of my mother's illness and her death. And there was one day when I was being interviewed on 2 radio stations in Philadelphia back to back, which happened to be in the same building. So I was on the first show, and before we began, the interviewer said, "Today we are interviewing Andrew Solomon about his novel A Stone Boat. It's a book that portrays an idealized, romanticized relationship between a son and his mother, lyrically and beautiful, blah, 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 blah." So I did the interview. So then I went up 3 floors and I sat down. We're live, we're on air. Today, we're talking to Andrew Solomon, author of a book about the ultimate monster mom. And I thought, it has nothing to do with what you write. It's all projection.
Anyone else on the panel want to say something?
I got a letter once from a woman who said I'd abandoned her in Bermuda, wasn't it, Tanya? And I didn't answer to hire a lawyer because I thought I could establish before a jury that I'd never been in Bermuda.
Any other confessional remarks?
I had one of the first interviews when my book came out was a journalist. We met at a museum, and we were getting ready to get started with this recorded interview, and he didn't ask his first question. He kept staring at me, and finally I said, "Should we start?" And he said, "You don't look murderous."
I have a broad question for all authors. Basically, what was your inspiration or your motivation to pick up the pen initially? Like, before you wrote any of your books, before you had any fans, what was your purpose for picking up the pen and actually deciding to put your words and thought on paper?
You know, I think probably if you asked everybody here, you'd get the same answer, but it's probably different in certain ways. But you just have a story to tell. I think you just think, wow, people should know this. And I know for someone who writes nonfiction, you're learning things as you go, and it's fascinating to you, and you want to tell people. So you tell your wife at the dinner table, you wouldn't believe what I just read, and you tell those stories. And you want to just reach people and tell these people and get them excited about things. So I think that's sort of what's behind every writer, but it probably starts in different ways.
I thought of something that Mr. Barry said. I grew up listening to my grandmother tell me stories about a land and a country I would never know as a boy, but I came to know as an adult. And I loved those stories, and I loved her, and I loved the way she told them, and I loved language. And then when you start writing, and I just love the way words came together. I think Tim O'Brien said last year, he doesn't write stories, he writes sentences. And all those things begin to accumulate so that one day you find yourself alone in a room with words because this past of love is behind you, and you write. So.
Thank you.
Part of it, too, it has a lot to do with reading. The response or the attraction that you have for books, and also the response that comes when you read something that speaks to you. I have to say that I am really honored to be here at a table of writers that I have read and have completely blown me away with the stories and the words and the sentences on the page. Tim, your stories, How to Tell a True War Story, I could not have started writing my book if I hadn't read that. And if I hadn't been so in awe, but also inspired by the stories there that made me feel like I had a freedom to tell the type of stories I wanted to tell. So maybe it all starts with reading as much as anything else.
Yeah, I would echo that and add that it needn't be high literature that inspires one to want to write. I remember as a kid being inspired by the Hardy Boys and Tom Swift and Nancy Drew, being taken to other worlds and having adventures. And granted, it was not high literature, but it made me it ignited in me a storytelling impulse that has never gone away. And it's so easy, especially as accomplished writers, for all of us to always point to the elevated writers, the Flannery O'Connors of this world, and of course they inspired us. However, I'm not sure I would have gotten there had it not been for a book called Larry of the Little League, or
Yes. The other thing I'd see, as an editor, I always like to be surprised. And so I think that the writing a sentence and another sentence and another sentence is very, very important, and it's not easy. We get at the review what I've called a story that has 4 or 5 elements in it, and there's usually a guy, a gun, a dog, a girl, and a pickup truck. And we get a lot of them.
Can I ask a quick question on the same subject?
Sure.
What does your educational background have to do with your writing?
Oh yeah, I can answer this. I wasn't the best high school student. My mom always, she was a single mom, a doctor. She always put me in extra classes so that I wouldn't get into trouble in summer school. And I remember I went to register for my senior year of high school, and they said, you're done. Like you'd finished. And I remember walking home alone that day. But I became a construction worker, and I worked mid-rise in industrial construction for several years. And I came to college late, and I was not a good student. Everyone seemed cooler, like they knew what Kurosawa movies were, and I didn't know any of this. And my grades were bad. And I had a friend who always gave me tips on the easy A classes, the history of jazz, music appreciation, And one day he was like, Adam, creative writing. And he was like, it's the easiest A at Arizona State University. And it was taught by a new professor named Ron Carlson, who was a writer's writer, just a fabulous, fabulous writer. He had just been hired. He was full of energy. And all my perceived flaws, teachers had always told me that I was a daydreamer, that I was an exaggerator, that I was a liar, that I was a rubbernecker. And these were all true. But I wrote my first story, and for a narrative, this daydreaming, this exaggeration, this interest in details, like they all combined to make something good, and that had never really happened for me. I think it was like my only epiphany in life. Like this was, like I made something that mattered, and it was the first time that it ever really happened. And I became like an autodidact after that. I was just, all I wanted in my life was stories and narrative. And it wouldn't have happened without a mentor and without that setting. And maybe the education of the real world of being out there on those tall buildings for many years. But and I remember another mentor of mine, Tobias Wolff, who taught me when I came to Stanford. One of the first things he said to us is that the act of writing is so noble an endeavor that no attempt could ever be a failure. And I've never forgotten that. And so I think I was given permission by some people, and it's those, I think, mentor-protege relationships that really are the true education of a writer.
Yeah. Does anybody on the panel want to talk a little bit about that the question of, I think it was put, education as such?
Well, I will tell my narrative, which is that I was a kind of grade-grubbing teacher's pet, and therefore the exact opposite of what you've described. And I always wanted to be a writer. In fact, friends of my parents are given to saying, I remember when you were 3 years old and you said you were going to write books, and now you're doing it. It was all always there. But I remember my creative writing class when I was in college, which was taught by a very brilliant, rather obsessive novelist called Walter Abisch. And it was the advanced fiction writing class. And it was basically a class on how to write like Walter Abisch. And the first day of the class, everyone was asked to read his or her story aloud. And everyone read them aloud. And there was one person who was in the class who I was just kind of surprised was in the class. She didn't seem like someone who would have been suited to, and she read a story which was all about a girl who was on her father's farm and trying to decide whether she should sleep with the groom, who she found really attractive, and so on and so forth. Anyway, it went on in that vein. It was sort of sweet and romantic. And then as the term went on, each class, one person would be asked to read his or her story aloud, and she was never asked to read her story the whole term. And then the last day of class, we were all asked to read our stories aloud again. And she read hers, which began, "He was glad he had shot his daughter right there in the restaurant." Glad, glad, glad. So I always sort of cleaved to that. I think the teaching really for me was the teaching of reading. And my mentor and the professor who sort of most influenced me, I think, when I was in college, I remember once objecting to some literary critical essays that had been published, and he said, "What is the purpose of a work of criticism if not to help people who would not otherwise have access to them to see the beauties and accomplishments of a piece of work?" He said, "What is it if not to reveal to us what the beauties are within something?" I set out thinking that I would mostly write fiction. I've written fiction and nonfiction, but nonfiction has ended up being my focus. And I always think of that statement, and I always think there's so much beauty hidden in the world and not seen by other people. And that mission of finding the beauty within works of literature and then translating it out into the larger world, that's really been my purpose. And I feel very, very grateful to that professor. It's a moment. I remember him saying it. I remember where we were. I remember it all. It was really a transformative moment for me. I thought, oh yes, that's why we're doing this. That's why.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming. It's been an evening to remember. There are some very wise, very kind things, and some really funny things were said. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank a round of applause for all of these individuals.